This is JC again to tell you one more short story. This is a true story, and as a matter of fact, I'm one of these fellows, and later on, if you want to, you can try to guess which one it was. But I'm not going to use my own name, James, and I certainly am not going to tell Kenneth's name because there's no telling who might be listening to these, and we sure don't want them to know who we are. So anyhow, I'll tell it in the third party mode, and it's called George and Carl Gone Fishing. This happened over in Clarkston, Washington, around there. It's just right across the river from Lewiston, Idaho. I got my Lewiston hat on now that my little girl gave me. So anyhow, without further ado, we'll go on with the story. George and Carl were about as close as two friends could be. George was a medium-sized aquarian, about 5 feet 8.5 inches tall, and 155 pounds with no fat. This was a while back, you understand. He wasn't a muscular fellow, but he was well built and just a little bit good looking, maybe a little more than a little bit, sort of good looking. Now Carl, he was a typical Scorpio male. He was tall and wiry, narrow at the hip and wide at the shoulders, with a ruddy complexion and a slightly rusty reddish hair, and he was very athletic. George and Carl worked at the same plywood paper mill. It was Potlatch Forest Industries, as a matter of fact, in Lewiston, Idaho. George was a crackerjack plywood maker, about the best they had, and Carl was a top-notch paper maker. On their days off, they were always together doing something. George worked 8 hours a day from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., 5 days a week. Once in a while he worked overtime, a double shift, but that was the exception rather than the rule. Well, Carl, on the other hand, he worked a weird rotating shift so that every 3 cycles he had 4 consecutive days off. When that happened, the two boys popped a diet pill apiece, loaded up the cool chest with sandwiches and Budweiser beer. They rolled a few joints strictly for medicinal purposes, just in case, and they headed for a 2-day sturgeon fishing trip on the Snake River, just upstream from Clarkston, Washington, toward a little town called Soton. Usually it was a little place in the bend there called Buffalo Eddy. Very good sturgeon fishing. Sounds pretty pleasant, doesn't it? Well, it was typical days off stuff for these boys. Or at least it started typical. Now the boys had everything packed up and they were just about ready to head for the river. Carl usually drove because George always got a bit of a head start on the pills, he being an impatient sort and was hyper. However, this time they both got head starts, if that's possible, and not only was George loaded, but Carl was soaring. Carl had a 3/4 ton 4x4 Chevy pickup, which they always drove to the river. George had an Olds 98 automobile that he drove. This time they were missing a certain type of bait and they needed to go to the next small town to get some. Rather than drive the pickup all that way, they decided to drive the Oldsmobile since it would be quicker and more comfortable, by the way. Now, if you've ever been high on diet pills, you can understand that things tend to speed up just a teensy-weensy bit when you get in a hurry. It seems like the hurrier you get, the speeder upper things are. And today would be no exception, I guarantee you. Carl and George got in the Olds 98 and they headed for the small town to get the missing sturgeon fishing bait. Now, George had been planning to change the oil in his car for some time, and there was 5 quarts of oil in the trunk. After they had driven a ways, George, wired to the hilt and ready for anything and everything, decided this would be a great time to change the oil in his car. Carl, also super wired, agreed, so they watched for a side road, a dirt road that led away from the highway. They found one right away and turned down it and headed from the highway and civilization. And this is a little asterisk. In those days when you lived in the country and you needed to change your car's oil, you found an out-of-the-way place where there's a slight depression over which you can pull the car. There you crawl under the car, you drain the oil out into the depression so it flows away from you and away from the car tires. Well, when George was loaded, he wasn't the sharpest tack in the box, as you will soon see. They found the right depression and George crawled under the Oldsmobile. He removed the oil pan drain plug and he watched the oil drain from the car. He noted how neat the oil looked as it rushed into the depression / oil drain place and flowed away to wherever old used drain oil flows to. He replaced the drain plug and slid out from under the car and proceeded to pour the new oil into the oil spout to refill the engine. When he finished, he checked the dipstick. Well, it was covered with oil, maybe a little too much, but he noted that he hadn't changed the oil filter, so that would account for the slightly excessive oil on the dipstick. Good job. Now let's get some fishing done. Oops. He got into the car, started it up, and let it run for a few seconds. It was so much quieter now. New oil works wonders. He slipped the transmission into drive to pull away, and nothing happened. He looked at Carl. What the heck is wrong? At this time, it would be impossible to determine which of these two workers was the loadedest, if there is such a word, and I'm sure there was then. Carl said to try it again. Well, George tried it again. Nothing happened again, the same way it did the first time. Well, Carl got out and opened the hood and checked the oil. He saw it was all right, just a little bit overfilled. He got back in the car and they discussed it briefly. Even if the oil was a bit over, the car should still go. Carl asked if George could think of any other reason the car wouldn't move. Well, George mentioned that the new oil was a different color, but that shouldn't make any difference. Carl asked what color it was, and George said amber. Carl asked what color the old oil was. George said purple. Duh. A huge light came on above Carl's head, so bright it almost blinded both of them. Carl got back out of the car and told George to get out too. He raised the hood and once again checked the oil. The dipstick showed 10 quarts of oil. Then he checked the transmission dipstick. This dipstick showed 0 quarts of transmission fluid. It was almost dry. Shaking his head, Carl started walking down the dirt road back the way they had come. George asked Carl where he was going, and Carl said, to town to buy some purple transmission fluid. Well, George and Carl were very late getting to their fishing spot that night, and this episode was never mentioned again until right now. I have no idea what story they told their wives as to why it took so long to get the sturgeon bait, but I know it must have been a dandy. Thank you very much. That's the story of George and Carl gone fishing.